And so now we can welcome everyone to part 2 of our Kipaipai happy hour with Betty Brown, and she's going to continue from the first session that we had a couple weeks ago on understanding abstraction. And I'm just going to go ahead, Betty, if you want to like share your screen, have Betty get started. We're going to jump right into it. If everybody will mute themselves too, that would be helpful.
You want me to mute myself?
No, everybody else, silly.
That was a joke. That was my beginning attempt at humor.
Okay.
So welcome back, everybody.
Are we not going to see you?
I'm sorry?
We don't see you. Your camera's turned off.
That's right.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I know I have learned that there are some people who did not go to the first one. And because it was several weeks ago, I'm going to go ahead and start with a little bit of a review. The point of this conversation is to explore meaning in abstract art, which by extension is exploring meaning in all art, but I want to focus on the abstract art because that is the most challenging for the general public, and most of you all do abstract art. So I'm sure you all are aware that that is a Frank Stella on that first image. So I began last time with this quote from Shirin Neshat, who's one of my favorite contemporary artists. She writes that it's every artist's responsibility to make art that is meaningful. And I totally agree with that because I am very aware that what distinguishes us from any other animal is that we human beings make meaning. Our minds create connections and make meaning out of things like, well, a photograph of a woman with text on her face and a gun bifurcating her face. What is that meaning? We don't need to go into it here. I also began with this tweet from our beloved former president. I'm being facetious. Donald Trump tweeted, "Abstract painting is not good painting. It has a lot of problems, ugly, and usually looks like it was made by babies. Sad." Nobody here doubts that that came from Trump because that's exactly the way he speaks. And the whole point of this conversation tonight is to understand why that attitude is so prevalent, because it certainly is. So to understand that, I'm going to deconstruct that statement at the very end. It's actually the last slide where I go through the statement again and deconstruct it. But in order to be equipped to really deconstruct it and think about it critically, we have to do 3 things. First of all, we have to understand what the term abstract means. Then we have to look at various definitions of art over time because art has served different social functions over time. And finally, we have to discuss the meaning, the process of creating meaning in art. So, as I said, the number 1 is, what does abstract mean? Technically, all art is abstract because what artists do is translate the moving, changing, 3-dimensional form, a world, into a fixed, flat image, if it's a painting, or into a fixed solid shape, if it's a sculpture. So that translation of 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions, or big into little, that's considered an abstraction, an abstracting. But artists translate the chaotic and often mystifying inner and outer worlds into concrete and comprehensible form. That's what art is. It's a translation of the world into a smaller, flatter, fixed form. We often use the term abstract to mean non-objective, that is, no object is depicted, or non-representational, that is, no thing is represented in the work. According to this discussion, Picasso was not technically an abstract artist ever, because he never did a painting without an object, without representing something in the world. Of course, most often his girlfriends. So I said the second thing we need to do after understanding what abstract is think about how art functioned over time. And I have condensed that multivalent history into 4 functions of art. They are discrete categories, and I'm going to present them as such, but the truth is they have permeable boundaries, and they often overlap. So an expressionist painting can also be formalist. We'll talk about what that means later. Anyway, what I did last time is I went through the first 3. Just to remind you, we first spoke about realism, which is art that is based on looking real, on imitating the real world. So people respond to it by saying it looks so real, or it looks like it's supposed to, right, true, and beautiful. With most realist art, the assumption is that it's telling a story. And the narrative, the story it tells, is shared, is known by the intended viewers. Further, realism is linked to technical excellence. So Michelangelo's David is a perfect example of realist sculpture. There's not a person who doesn't immediately recognize that that represents a human body. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, 2 legs, 2 arms, and a torso. We know that's a human body. We also know that it represents David, and most of us are familiar with the story from the Bible of David. Everyone whom Michelangelo thought would see it was very familiar with that story. And realism really comes to us ultimately as we practice it now from the Greeks, where realism was linked to beauty, and beauty was linked to knowledge, truth, goodness, nature, and art. For the Greeks, what looked good was good. And by the way, Michelangelo thought that as well. He thought the most beautiful bodies were the most sacred ones. Greeks thought of beauty in 2 ways. As an appearance, it looks beautiful, and this Apollo is, of course, drop dead gorgeous, but also as function. Beauty carried meaning. The form carried the meaning. And both Aristotle and and Plato talk about that. They came to different conclusions about it, but they both agreed that beauty functioned as part of meaning. Western art, which is what we're talking about today, not because it's the best or the only kind of art, but because that's today's conversation. I think I mentioned last time that Western art is actually not even my favorite kind of art. My favorite kind of art is Aztec art. That's what I did my PhD on, but that's not the discussion today. Western art was primarily realistic from the time of the Greeks. This is, of course, 5th century BC, to the 19th century, when expression became more important than representation. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So from the time of the Greeks all the way through into the 19th century, of course, this is right before the 19th century, but I hope the point carries. Realism was the primary goal of Western art. This is Jacques-Louis David, the French academic artist, and it's his depiction of a story that we don't know in 21st century America, but in the late 18th century was a very popular story out of Roman history. And just like the French who saw this wouldn't know who Mickey Mouse was, most of us don't know this story, but his intended viewers did. Gustave Courbet, a few decades after David, made the decision to separate his quest for beauty and the ideal from his realist portrayals. In doing that, he violated viewers' expectations. Abstract art violates Donald Trump's expectations in much the same way. Viewers come to art expecting certain things, and Courbet violated those expectations. And in doing so, he initiated what we call avant-garde art. Most of what I'm going to show you from this point forward is considered avant-garde art. And you should know that even today, almost 200 years after Courbet, realism is still the basis for a lot of art production. It's not that, or the Greeks did it, so it's not valid anymore. It's absolutely valid now. This is a contemporary Chinese artist, and his realist paintings are based on photographs. There's another one of his. And I remind you that photographs are historically linked to painting because Louis Daguerre, who took out the first patent on a photographic process, developed photography in a quest for increased realism in his paintings. So the second function of art historically is called expressionism. And I have a quote from not a visual artist, but a literary artist, Leo Tolstoy here. Art is not a handicraft. It is the transmission of a feeling an artist has had. Now that is expressionism in a nutshell. And you should be very aware that when we look at Jacques-Louis David's painting, it is not expressing his feelings, is it? We don't know if he was in a good mood when he did this, or a bad mood, or has just broken up with his girlfriend, or that he was wondering about death. He created beautiful, ideal images depicting a narrative that was significant to the French people, who were, by the way, building up for a revolution. But we have no idea what he was feeling. This is not expressing the artist's feelings. So expressionism is based on the premise that artists are inspired by emotional experiences and then use their skills to embody their emotions in works of art. So they're inspired by the emotional experience, they use their visual skills to embody their emotions, and they do so with the intention of stimulating the same emotions in viewers. This concept about what art is grew out of 18th and 19th century Romanticism. It is only a couple hundred, at most, a couple hundred years old, but it is the dominant understanding of people today. The general public believes that art is expressionist and that the artist is expressing his feelings. Artists take undeveloped feelings that are vague or only partially formed, and they give it form. Another tenet of expressionism is that viewers are active participants in the creation of the artwork. That artists create this and put it out there, but it's not complete until a viewer sees it and has a reaction. So again, expressionism, the artist is expressing his or her feelings. And this is my favorite example of early expressionism. You know it very well, Van Gogh's Night Cafe. And you may not be aware that he actually wrote a letter to his brother Theo about this painting, in which he said, I have tried to express, there's that key word, the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. And you can read the rest of the letter if you choose. Van Gogh was fully conscious of what he was doing. A lot of people tend to trivialize him and think that, you know, he was crazy. He was so conscious, so deliberating, and so intellectually astute that he was fully aware that he was distorting color and form for expressive purposes. He writes about it here. And in doing so, he deliberately de-skilled his technique as part of his rejection of academic art. So what I'm saying is, Van Gogh grew up when this was the ideal, and he chose to reject it in part by de-skilling his technique. He didn't want it to be fancy and perfect and photographic. He wanted it to be distorted just enough and the color intensified just enough so that it carried an emotional thrust. Picasso taking this idea of de-skilling a little bit further. Picasso said, it took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. So he doesn't use the term de-skilling there, but we know children are not technically skilled. He is saying that he got the technique down in 4 years. His father was an academic art teacher, but it took him a lifetime to de-skill enough so that his work had a childlike authenticity. And after Van Gogh, Expressionism spread through Europe in the early 20th century. This is obviously a German Expressionist painting. It is clearly de-skilled. It's based on violent colors and exaggerated lines. So I like that paragraph, that sentence at the very bottom. Expressionists were trying to depict inner experience, seeking to depict not objective reality, but the subjective emotions and responses that objects and events aroused in them. So this von Heister is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And obviously it is a powerfully evocative image of its subject, the feeling of anger. It wasn't just the Germans, though, who picked up on Van Gogh's innovations. Russian artist Vasily Kandinsky took Expressionism to total abstraction in works like this 1914 improvisation. And as I'm sure you know, 4 years before that, he had already written a book about abstract art that he called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. So since 1910, there has been an explicit link between abstract art and spiritual content. For Kandinsky, the work is gushy and improvisational and expressive. So again, you can read all that. I don't need to reread it. But I remind you that Kandinsky was by no means the only Russian who worked in the early 20th century towards total abstraction. So did Kazimir Malevich. This painting called The Black Square, which on my computer looks kind of coffee brown. It is not, that's just my computer distorting it. And it is totally reduced to the form of a black square, but Malevich also had spiritual intentions. Here is the exhibition in which he first exhibited the black square. And do you see that it's up there in the top corner of the room here? Kandinsky was deliberately and consciously trying to create a new icon of spirituality for the Russian Revolution. And why am I so sure that that's the case? Because where he hung that one painting is exactly where the Russians traditionally hung their religious icons. Up in the corner, do you see the Virgin Mary on the right? Up in the corner so she could look out over the whole room. And obviously the black square is right there. Now, fast forward from the time of Malevich to the era of the Second World War, and we come to Expressionism that's abstract in New York City, where it is known, of course, as abstract expressionism. You should be aware that one of Jackson Pollock's influences was Kandinsky, and another influence, if you skip down to here, was Surrealism, which is why I have started my look at Pollock with this Surrealist painting by Max Ernst, who sought to portray the unconscious as this amorphous, monstrous-like figure, and abstract, expressive painting coming directly out of the unconscious. So that was what the Surrealists brought to the party, and Pollock picked up on. The connection between Pollock and Max Ernst is largely through this woman, Peggy Guggenheim, and she and Pollock are standing in front of the mural that she commissioned for her New York apartment. She wanted this mural to fill a wall, and it would thereby become his largest piece. It came to Los Angeles a couple of years ago, well, more than a couple of years before COVID, to be restored at the Getty. So here is the whole mural, and you can see that it is totally abstract. If you see figures or faces or anything in there, that's just you projecting meaning onto this painting. Pollock has said two things that support considering him an expressionist. He said the modern artist is working with space and time, expressing his feelings rather than illustrating. He would have rather condescendingly considered Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii an illustration. And Pollock said something else. Abstract painting is abstract. Well, duh, thank you. But then he says it confronts you. I am going to come back to this idea of abstract painting confronting you in a minute. Here's a detail of the Pollock, and you can see that his spiraling, curving, layered gestural work actually does hark back to our man Kandinsky and some of his paintings. Okay, another abstract and expressionist, and frankly my favorite, is Mark Rothko, who was also Russian. And Rothko did the spectacular abstraction that you see behind him. And he writes really interestingly, I'm not an abstractionist. I'm not interested in the relationship of color or form. I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions. So he's claiming his role as an expressionist there. And then he adds, the fact that people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures show that I can communicate those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. I have never cried in front of a Rothko, although I have been completely overwhelmed by them. But I have to tell you that I did break down and cry in front of some Van Goghs in Amsterdam. So I understand what he's talking about. If you're so moved by a painting that you literally break down and cry in the museum, that tells you the painting is about emotions. So here is the Rothko at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And here is the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas, where some of his paintings are put on the walls like religious icons, and people come to pray and meditate and do Bible studies in this space. A similar room is found in Taos, New Mexico, where an 8-sided room is dedicated to the work of Agnes Martin. Agnes Martin is also an artist who seeks to express feelings. My paintings are about quiet happiness, like the light in the morning. My paintings are like happiness. She was what is usually considered a reductive abstract painter. She reduced her painting to nothing, 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 nothing. But her works can also be considered formalist, which is what we will consider next. So the third historic function of art is called formalism. And if I were going to give you a quote of what somebody would say about formalism, it would be, I really like the color, like I love that color in that Helen Frankenthaler. I like the shape or the texture, and I really like the shapes and textures of that Goldsworthy. I really like the form of the artwork. So formalism, like expressionism, can really be seen to coalesce in the early 20th century. I'm using as an example here the very well-known masterwork by Piet Mondrian, the Dutch formalist. Formalism is premised on the idea that aesthetic values, the worth of an artwork, can stand alone, that judgments of art can be detached from content such as ethical, narrative, or social ones. Formalists give importance to the completely abstract qualities of the work, like this painting, based on the primary colors and a grid of black, rectilinear black lines over a white background. So these arrangements of visual elements are the basis of formalism. Pete Mondrian believed that this rectilinear grid and his reduction to just the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, would promote clarity, balance, peace, and reason. Mondrian thought that there was just way too much visual clutter out there, and if you simplified and clarified and rationalized the painting, the viewer would in turn have clarity and peace. So formalism was theorized in this country first by Clement Greenberg. He argued that we should ignore everything but the art's form. When he would write about something like Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii, he'd talk about how flat it is and how the planes are, the architectural planes are in, very shallow space behind the figures. And he thought that was like really the first modern painting because of its focus on flatness. He thought that flatness and frontality were the basis for good art. And he wanted art to be totally self-referring. As he wrote, modern art was ultimately about itself. The subject of art was art. So Frankenthaler and Greenberg were a couple in 5 pivotal years in New York City. This is the Helen Frankenthaler at the Huntington Museum. And it affects us in at least 2 ways. First, its immense scale. It is, as you can see, twice the size of that female viewer. And secondly, it is glorious in its use of color. So what I've just said are 2 formal qualities, color and scale. This doesn't make me feel anything except perhaps joy as I look at that wonderful orange color. I mentioned Andy Goldsworthy up front, and I'm sure you all know his work. I just found this piece this week, so I wanted to share it with you. It's called Stone Sea, and it's from 2012, and it's in the St. Louis Art Museum. And what it is 25 10-foot tall, perfect Roman arches that are made from the limestone bedrock of the city of St. Louis. So he went to St. Louis and he explored the geology, and he decided that this was the basis for St. Louis, so he would use it for his works. So there is no narrative here, and there is no expression of feelings. It's shapes, and we respond to those shapes in our bodies as we walk through them, or in our minds as we visually walk through them. There is a branch of philosophy known as Phenomenology. Its leaders are philosophers Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a German and a French man. Phenomenology is not a really intellectual pursuit, but it's more meditative, and it's more about reflecting with conscious awareness on your lived experience. And your lived experience is always subjective. It's always inside you. It's what you experience in your body. Awareness is always awareness of something, consciousness of something. And so the scale, materials, and history of this, we're aware of that. But the primary response is a physical one. So I think you can maybe understand that a little bit better if we come closer to home and look at light and space art. So in the 1960s, several California artists began to do what is called minimal art using light and space. They used new industrial materials that were often reflective and arranged abstract shapes in such a way that they made you see the space they were in a different way, and they made you see yourself in a different way. So one of the best known of these light and space artists from California was, of course, Larry Bell, who was born in Chicago but came to Los Angeles in the 1950s and for a long time has been living in Taos, where Agnes Martin was. And he used industrial materials to create these boxes that viewers walk around, and the boxes are mysterious. I know you can't really tell that in the photograph, but they're mysterious, and the space seems to shift before your very eyes. My favorite light and space artist is Robert Irwin, and this is a piece that he did in Venice, California, where he took the studio space that he had used for years, knocked out the front wall, and put a scrib on it. And then people came by and sat in front of it and watched how the light changed as the sun moved across the sky. A brilliant writer, Lawrence Weschler, talks about this process from the beginning. And he says down here, the room seemed to change its aspect, and as the day progressed, people came and sat across the street from it and watched for hours. The deal is it was just a cloth scrim as the facade of the building. It wasn't protected at all, but the building was never graffitied, never hurt. People were so respectful of this incredibly mystifying and enchanting work. Richard Serra is another important formalist artist. I'm sure that you are all aware of him, and you probably know that his art is very controversial. For example, this is his piece called Tilted Arc. It was commissioned by the US government for the Federal Plaza in New York City. And it's an immense tilted wall that curves very slightly that he placed in the plaza. People hated it. They hated it blocked the view. They hated that they had to walk around it. They thought it was ugly. As you can probably tell, they graffitied it. Those are marks covering up the graffiti. And they protested, you guys, for years until finally the government took it down. Poor Serra had been paid, but as he said, he designed this for the plaza. He can't put it anyplace else. It's a site-specific work. I'm focusing on this because I want to remind you that Trump is not the only one who has trouble with abstract art. Tons and tons of New Yorkers hated this and had so much trouble with it that literally they protested and wrote on it, and finally the government took it down. We have an incredible Serra here in Los Angeles, at Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Whenever I send my students there, this is their favorite artwork. This and the Chris Burden toy cars, which couldn't be more different, but I find it really beautiful. I find the texture of the metal and the way it's been rusted, it looks like velvet. It's really beautiful. And walking through these shapes, because the walls tilt, it really affects your body and your balance. It's like going into one of those haunted house places at an amusement park where they want to throw you off balance. This does that. And it is, I think, really quite beautiful. But there are people who don't like contemporary art and they don't get this at all. Another person that people don't tend to get is Donald Judd. And I have to admit that for years I didn't get his work either. There's the brother of this piece is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And I remember walking by it time and time again thinking, yeah, whatever. It just didn't do anything for me. But then I went to Marfa. Donald Judd realized that most of the time his sculptures were viewed in museums surrounded by artworks by other artists. And he thought that the artwork surrounding his work impacted it negatively. So he decided what he wanted to do was find a place where he could give minimal sculptors like himself, formalist sculptors like himself, whole huge rooms to put their art in, and only their art, nobody else. And he found that place in Marfa, Texas, a tiny little town in the middle of, nowhere. And he found an abandoned army base, which he purchased. And this view we have is one of the military sheds in the army base, which he took over. He took over 2 adjacent sheds, and he put into them 100 large aluminum cubes. They have windows on both sides, as you can see. Aluminum was milled, so it's very shiny and reflective, and each of the cubes is slightly different. Some of the walls lean in. Can you make out that those walls are actually leaning in? Can you see that? Those walls are leaning in. And can you see down here, there's one floor and then below it, another floor. So the proportions of this, the angles of this, they change on every one. You can see inside that one, this one you can't. And it's so beautiful and so peaceful and so meditative. I went from being a big Donald Judd detractor to thinking that this is the Sistine Chapel of the United States. It is that beautiful and peaceful and interesting. And I recognize full well that people who have not seen it or experienced it are going to look at this and think, whatever. That's what I mean by phenomenology. You've got to relate to this work in your body. You have to go there and have a physical contact with it. I don't mean touch it, please don't. But you have to have that kind of direct experience with a lot of formalist art. It just doesn't do the phenomenological thing in photographs. So what I've just discussed is realism, expressionism, and formalism. And I thought I'd just cap that off by showing you a realist sculpture. This is Polykleitos' Spear Bearer. It's a Roman copy of the Greek original. That is Auguste Rodin's The Thinker. I don't know if you guys know that the Thinker was on top of the gates of hell, so he's contemplating everlasting damnation. And this is on the right, of course, the Donald Judd. So formalist on the left, expressionist in the middle, intended to evoke feelings, and on the right, forms in space. So you can see that art has really gone through some big transitions. And the biggest transition came in around 1968, when we segued from modernism to postmodernism. And if I was Joe Blow from the street trying to analyze postmodernism, I would say, the artist has something interesting to say. She makes me see the world in a new way. And that's certainly true of Judy Baca's The Great Wall, the world's largest mural, which is a reconsideration of the history of Los Angeles from the point of view of people of color, whose histories have often been erased. So Judy is a wonderful person and an incredible artist and a spectacularly committed community builder. So she worked with over 400 kids, there's some of them right there, to create the Great Wall of Los Angeles. She found at-risk kids, gang kids, from East LA and got them together and taught them how to plan out a mural, how to fundraise a mural, how to execute a mural, how to design their section of the mural. And these kids have been committed to her and her art, and many of them to their own art ever since. This, for example, is the view of the story of the fact that barrios were cleaned out to build Dodger Stadium. Did you guys know that? A whole lot of neighborhoods were just erased, knocked out to build Dodger Stadium. And here are some of the kids. One of the former mayors of LA worked with Judy Baca. So Judy Baca writes about the fact that she wants to make art that has meaning beyond just decorative values. She wants to create the public space to raise consciousness about the presence of people who may be numerically the majority of the population, but who are not usually represented. So this is a mural that she did for the Robert F. Kennedy School. And you see Robert F. Kennedy there with Cesar Chavez. So we have two of our great leaders of the 20th century as a depiction of, you know, an important part of the American story. So if we need a theoretical perspective for postmodernism, the one I would suggest is cognitivism. And cognitivists think that art provides knowledge of the world in unique and powerful ways. And that such knowledge would be lost to us if it were presented in forms other than artistic forms. In other words, they say, art is a special way of knowing the world. I'm guessing most of you, maybe all of you, agree with that. One way of knowing the world is through emotions. That's where cognitivism and expressionism overlap. But other ways are intellectual, physical, and process-oriented. A lot of postmodern art, a lot of art today is conceptually based. So it can be analyzed in terms of the intellectual knowing of cognitivism. If it's based on a concept, that's an intellectual thing. But not all art is that way, as you all know very well. A lot of it can be very physical, like the Goldsworthy and Serra. And a lot of it can be process-oriented. I haven't necessarily shown you any process-oriented art. I realize that now, but it's there. So one postmodernist who is very conceptually based is Fred Wilson. I'm sure you guys know his story. He actually supported his art habit for years as the guard in a museum. And as he worked in that museum, he began to think about the artworks in the museum telling different stories than the white curators had told. And so he began to create often ironic juxtapositions of pre-existing objects to communicate something new. So he writes, I get everything that satisfies my soul from bringing together objects that are in the world and manipulating them and having things presented in the way I want to see them. So he's thinking this through. He didn't take that photograph. He found it in the museum. He didn't create those African-American figurines, some of which were doorstops. He found them. And he's juxtaposing that ironic image of the African-American with a photograph of real African-Americans, asking us to think through the contrasts. That's the intellectual thing that's happening behind his work. And, you know, there's another artist who also rearranges previously existing objects and challenges us to think about them in new ways. And that is, of course, the inimitable Betty Saar. who, if you notice, was born here in 1926, you guys. She's coming up on 100 really fast. It's pretty exciting. Anyway, Betty Saar's most famous piece is The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. So like Fred Wilson, she is taking previously existing objects and rearranging them to make a point. So all of these objects tell stories, but the way she rearranges them challenge the traditional stories, which is, of course, precisely what Fred Wilson was doing here. So she didn't create any of these objects. She found them, assembled them, and put them, can you tell it's in a shallow box? And there is a mirror lining the inside of the shallow box. So these images, the piece is called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. I'm sure many of you grew up with Aunt Jemima pancakes and Aunt Jemima syrup. Aunt Jemima is a depiction of the stereotype of what is called the happy mammy, the happy mammy. And the happy mammy is just this incredibly offensive cliche that suggests that Black women would be happy to take care of white families. Can you get the irony of that? This is a postcard that she found. This is one of those figures like Fred Wilson's. This is the broom that she actually is holding, and this gun is something that Betty Saar gave her because, again, this is about the liberation of Aunt Jemima. The multiple images of Aunt Jemima across the background of this artwork and their infinite reflections in the mirrors that line it, remind us how cliches and stereotypes become cultural language through infinite repetition. To go back to Fred Wilson again, look at how many of these there are. And there were thousands of them. Infinite repetition reinforces the stereotype, reinforces the cliche. So Betty Saar is turning that on its head. This is not a happy mammy. This is a woman who's got a gun and is standing behind, I don't know, can you make that out? It's a Black power fist. It's a wooden carved hand doing the Black power fist. So she is inverting the stereotype, isn't she? You might even say she's deconstructing it. By the way, the company finally realized how offensive their Aunt Jemima products were, and they're not around anymore. I mean, the company may be around, I don't know, but the Aunt Jemima is not around anymore. Mulligan, if you don't get down, you're going to have to go into the garage. Okay. It's really hard to do a PowerPoint when your cat is standing between you and the computer. Okay. Here's another postmodern artist. I'm sure you are all familiar with her. This is Barbara Kruger. She was born in New Jersey, but now lives in Los Angeles. And she is well known for her image and text works. You all may not be aware that none of her images is an original. She doesn't make these photographs. She finds them, she takes them. In postmodern parlance, it's said she appropriates them. And then she pairs them with text. And the text is done in the style of public address. Your body. So she's talking to you, the viewer. Your body is a battleground. And of course, in this case, she's talking particularly to women because of the battle over abortion rights, which, God help us, continues today. This is another Barbara Kruger, which has, in my opinion, a wonderful feminist concept. So here we have what the casual viewer might think is a photograph of a woman, but if you look more carefully, you'll see that that is not a woman. That is a sculpture of a woman. This is the pedestal, right? So she found this sculpture and she found this photograph of this sculpture, And she paired it with this statement, your gaze hits the side of my face. In this case, she is not talking to women, is she? So she was talking to women here, your body is a battleground, but here the your refers to men. And it's a link between, she's referring to the link between men, between the male gaze, men looking at women, men objectifying women, and the violence against women. Psychiatrists will tell you that it's really hard to do violence to somebody if you recognize their full humanity. If you look in their eyes and see that they are fully human like you, it's really hard to do violence to them. But if you think of them as a thing, as an object, as a lesser being, it's easier to do violence to them. So Kruger here is asking us to consider how the objectification of women is linked to the violence against women. One more Barbara Kruger, obviously I like her a lot, and I like the concept she deals with. So remember again, we're talking cognitivism, dealing with intellectual concepts. So here we have a photograph again that she found, did not take, of Howdy Doody. And I'm just old enough that I grew up on Howdy Doody. He was one of the first children's television characters. And by the way, the sponsor of the Howdy Doody program was for years Camel cigarettes. So this program was aimed at children and advertising cigarettes. Wow. That couldn't happen today, but it certainly happened back in my childhood. And what Barbara Kruger has put here is when I hear the word culture, I take out my checkbook. Because we live in a capitalist culture, and the goal of our culture is to sell things, generate more money, generate more value. And then tiny by the mouth, do you see the words down there? We mouth your words, we mouth your words. And it took me a while to figure that out, but you guys, how many times have you heard yourself singing the songs of a commercial? How many jokes have you heard or even perhaps told about characters in commercials? Where's the beef? Television commercials work on repetition as much as cliches and stereotypes do. If you've ever been analytical about watching broadcast television, you probably were aware that they give you that same damn commercial 10 times in some long programs, because it's the repetition that breaks down your analytical resistance and gets right in there to your unconscious. So without thinking about it, you're going to go buy their product. That's their goal. Television was created as an advertising medium in this country. The role of most broadcast television is to round up an audience for the commercials. And Barbara Kruger is talking about that in pieces like this. So we've talked about 4 different kinds of art. As you noticed, none of the postmodern artists I mentioned dealt with totally abstract imagery. They all had figurative, content-laden work. So abstract art is generally not postmodern. It is generally formalist or formalist with an expressionist intent. So what about this abstract art, and why, again, is it so difficult? Well, the big blocks of color, the splatters, and the large expanses of blank space make some viewers really uncomfortable. They get nervous. They are filled with anxiety. And sometimes they go into anger. Remember what Pollock said. Abstract art confronts you. And people confronted with something they don't understand can freak out or get pissed off. Abstract art doesn't give it away. It asks you to bring your own interpretation to the table. But a lot of people are afraid that they're just going to end up giving the wrong answer. And so they resist having any engagement with the art. They're afraid they don't understand it. They don't want to have anything to do with it. I've never watched a television program and said, I don't know what that was about. I don't know what happened. Because television goes for the largest audience. It goes for the lowest common denominator. It's simple. It's easy to understand. Abstract art is not simple or easy to understand, and it threatens a lot of people. So if abstract art doesn't create meaning by being realist or expressionist or postmodern, what kind of content does it have? What is the meaning of something like Serra's band at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art? Well, to answer that, I'd like to suggest that you can actually think about art making as a three-step practice. First of all, you as an artist are inspired by an experience, an object you see, a view of a sunset, an emotion that you feel. You're inspired by some kind of experience. And you translate that experience into form. I can't tell you how many artists have talked to me and said, I didn't realize what I was doing. And once I got done with it, I looked at it and I went, that looks like X. So I'm not saying that this is always a conscious step one, step two, but it can be if you bring your awareness into a heightened relationship to it. But the third step is a step that's totally out of your control. The viewer completes the artwork by seeing it and figuring out. That is part of the process that co-creates meaning with the artist. I'm sure some of you are like, what is she talking about? The viewer completes the artwork. Well, several critics have talked about that, but from my studies, I believe the first one who really grappled with it intelligently was my man, Marcel Duchamp. He was, I'm sure you all know, a leading figure in the Dada movement. And he argued that you've got to have the artist and the viewer to complete the artwork. So he posited that the creation of art begins with the artist, who's often working in isolation in the studio, but that the artwork is not completed until it's out in the world and viewed by others. So in 1973, you guys, 50 years ago, he concluded the creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act. So this may be an uncomfortable concept for some of you, or an unheard concept for some of you, but I ask you to consider it because I believe that it's true. The artist is inspired by an experience. It can be emotional, intellectual, or formal. The artist translates that experience into form, gives it a shape as a painting or a sculpture or a video or an installation. And the viewer completes the artwork and by seeing it and figuring it out. And that seeing it and figuring it out allows her to co-create meaning with the artist. So if viewers are definitionally confronted by abstract art, if they are challenged by it, if they are made nervous or angry by it, it's going to be hard for them to figure out the artwork. To get abstract art, viewers need to be somewhat familiar with the history of abstraction. They have to have some understanding of what abstraction is all about. But they also need to be advocates. They need to be on the side of art and artists. If they don't care about art, if they don't care about artists, they're not going to be open to co-creating the artwork. They're just going to resist it and say it's ugly and worthless and a child could do it. So how can we convert the public to become advocates for contemporary abstract art? Well, we can talk about what inspired you. We can talk about how you translate that experience into form, what materials you use, and how and why you use them. And we can invite viewers to talk about what they think the image could mean, what they feel like as they stand there, what it makes them wonder about. Remember, viewers are already familiar with abstract concepts like love, sorrow, peace, and compassion. You can't take a photograph of love. You can take a photograph of two people who appear to be in love, but that concept, that abstract concept, love, you can't take a photograph of that. You can't represent it realistically. You can't represent it realistically. Abstract art is the only avenue for the expression, depiction, embodiment, or artistic recreation of abstract concepts, like Rothko and the religious feelings that he sought to communicate, like sorrow, like peace, which is what I feel when I see an Agnes Martin. These are all experiences that your viewers are all going to have had. But I remind you that most of us have some level of trouble talking about emotional experiences. That's why so many of us are in therapy. We have trouble talking about our feelings. So when you do an abstract artwork that is expressive and it is intended to evoke feelings, some people are going to have trouble with that because they have trouble talking about their feelings. Our culture tells us that, you know, emotions are worthless female stuff. And men are told they shouldn't really have emotions except anger. I mean, I'm speaking in gross, ridiculous generalities, but my point is taken. We have ambivalence about emotions. So art that evokes emotions is going to evoke ambivalence for some of us. It's just there. So again, do these three things. Help them see it because, as I said, they're going to co-create the art. They're going to give it full life. So I know it's 8 o'clock, it's after 8, but I'm going to go a little bit longer. I hope you don't mind. I want to show you just a couple of artworks and talk about a little bit about the meaning. So one of my favorite contemporary artists, perhaps my single favorite contemporary artist, is Martin Puryear. And in 2019, he was at the Venice Biennale. He had the American Pavilion. And this is a view of two of his artworks there. And as you can see, they are abstract sculptures. They are made with simple, easy to recognize materials. And they are shapes that are suggestive, but not descriptive. So I look at this and it looks like something in between a pumpkin and a skirt. And then I look at this and is that a tool? Is it a brace? Is that a tool? And then back here, is that a crate? And what's this? So there are no logical, rational, easy explanations of Puryear's work, are there? And yet this was the entrance to the American Pavilion. And yet when we think of artworks like this, we acknowledge that they do something to us and they make us think in new ways. This piece of carved wood, or multiple pieces of carved wood, and the metal cap over them are suggestive of baskets or logs, or maybe a roof. Is that a house-like structure? My efforts at trying to assign a concrete meaning to this work, to this very, may I say, poetic work, my efforts at that are inherently valuable. My looking at something that I don't immediately recognize and I'm not able to contain in a preconception forces me to open my mind and think about new ideas. Puryear doesn't give you easy. He gives you challenging because he knows that's what's going to get your head to move into new expansive places. I don't know if you can tell from these photographs, but this basket-like structure is all cast metal. And this is a hat-like structure, and oblique reference to the hats that the French revolutionaries wore. But it comes off as, a kneeling person, an animal, a dress. What is it? I don't know. And my engagement with it and the fact that he's forcing me to think about all these alternative possibilities, that's the value of it. The fact that he doesn't give me easy meaning and forces me to make that meaning is the way the artwork is completed. One more artwork from the Venice Biennale that year is Chihiro Shiota's The Key and Yarn Labyrinth. So in this artwork, I can recognize two things. I can recognize that there are wooden rowboats there, and I can recognize that there are keys. But I don't know what the keys have to do with the boats. And I sure don't know what either of them has to do with all this red yarn that makes a web or a cloud or a sky. And again, as with Martin Puryear, there is no single interpretation. As you guys know, I'm an art writer, and I always see my job as trying to open a door for people to understand what they're looking at. And I try really hard not to say this means that, but to say things like this suggests, or one possibility could be, or I think of X, Y, or Z when I look at this, so that you, the reader, can have the opportunity to complete their artwork on their own. Here's another one of her works from last year. And again, we see that boat-like shape, only this time it's just the outline of the boat. And these are letters of hope that she tied again to red yarn during the pandemic. So my favorite artwork at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in the last several years is this one by Zhu Jinsi, who is a painter. He's an abstract expressionist painter, but he also creates these amazing sculptures. They are so large, they fill up huge rooms, so you could call them installations. This is thousands of pieces of Japanese paper, folded, and strings tied to rocks at the bottom, holding the folded paper in this exquisite arc. When I see this, I am physically moved. It has an almost architectural presence, but then again, it's paper, so is paper architectural. And the paper itself has this exquisite texture. So I like it for the materials. I like it for the formal qualities, the shapes, the light, the objects, the colors. And I like it for the elusive poetic content, for the fact that it really challenges me to think about it and try to figure something out. If I were not an art advocate, if I didn't already wasn't already predisposed to feel positive about the visual arts, I might just think that that was, you know, kind of cool, but whatever. But because I am an art advocate and I come in already positively predisposed, I've spent a lot of time with this, looking at it, thinking about it, and allowing all the references of paper, rock, row, arches, lines, all of that to mess in my mind so that I can co-create the meaning with the artist. So I want to conclude by going back over that horrible tweet. At the beginning, he says, abstract painting is not good painting. The use of a phrase like good painting implies that there has always been a universal shared standard for art, for quality in art. That universal standard is called a canon, not like the cannon that you shoot in war, but with one end, canon. There has been no such standard. There is no universal canon for art. I know a lot of people think that, of course, everybody in the world would like Michelangelo's David, but I can tell you, as somebody who loves the Aztec culture, they would have been horrified by it. Because for them, appearing nude in public was the ultimate humiliation. And when they captured people from another culture and brought them into Tenochtitlan, their capital city, they stripped them to take away all their power symbols. So they would have been horrified that there's a 15-foot tall naked guy there. Why would you honor a captive victim like that? Horrible, horrible, horrible. So there has been no shared standard. First of all, we got to open up and accept that what we think is good in art is not what the next person does. We all are, it's relative, it's relative. Second thing he says is that has a lot of problems. It's ugly. Well, abstract art is only ugly if you think good painting is realist painting, representing the beautiful and the true. But if you have a different idea about what art should be or do, abstract art isn't necessarily ugly. It's just a different kind of art. I actually think my favorite art in contemporary times may be creepy, ugly art that has really interesting ideas. Because I like being attracted to the ugly. I like that tension. The third thing that he says is that it was made by, looks like it was made by babies. That is assuming that art should be created by well-trained technicians and that is fundamental to their value, technical skill. But I remind you that expressionists like Van Gogh deliberately de-skilled their work. They deliberately worked against the assumption that Trump made there about babies. A statement like that horrible man made reveals that the speaker can't understand or accept that art can be many different things. He's attached to ancient ideas about art that dictated it to be realist, true, and beautiful. And he wants his art to be easy to understand. And he doesn't realize that art can be realist, be something besides realist, true, and beautiful. He doesn't realize that art can be emotional, physical, challenging, and even ugly. But even in its ugliness, even in its challenge, it can be valuable, meaningful, and uplifting. Remember, Pollock said, abstract painting confronts you. Many people are threatened by such a confrontation. Many people looking at your art today are threatened by it. They don't know they're threatened by it. They would never admit that to their macho friends, but they are. And our job is to see if we can open them up a little bit and help them understand. I hope this presentation has helped you understand it a little bit and maybe even think slightly different things about your role as an artist. And I have added at the very end of this a link to a great essay that I read this week, but that was written some time ago from Art Space about the 10 art critics that changed art forever because they go through formalism, expressionism, realism, and postmodernism in their discussion. So it's a real short, very well written article. I'm not asking you to do a lot of reading of art critics. I mean, I wouldn't do it if I didn't have to. So much art criticism is pretentious and awful. But this is very well written, very clear and accessible. And these critics, these 10 critics, are people you might want to know. And you might want to understand what they have done to help the rest of the world understand what you do. So thank you for your attention, guys. It was really great putting this together, and I so appreciate your feedback. Thank you. And again, I'm sorry.
Thank you
I went over
so
time,
much.
but I did. So there.
Thank you so much, Betty. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Azam. And thank you, Andy, for making this happen.
Of course. And Betty, could
Yes,
you drop
thank
that link in the chat?
Thank you, Betty.
Okay.
Thank
you, Betty.
Okay, I'm going to put it right here. I'm going to put all of this.
Wow. Great. Thank you. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I can't get it into the chat right now, but Andy, I will put it on I Am an Artist, okay?
Okay, that works.
Okay.
That's great. Totally
That's
appreciate that.
fabulous.
Thank you so
Betty.
much, Betty. This was really wonderful, and I can't wait to post this on the website so people can watch both the first and second half. And again, I always think I know so much until I sit with you, and then I realize I don't know
Amen.
shit.
You know a lot, Andy. We just know different things.
So good.
That's true
Totally
for all
enjoyed it.
of you. And Andy, as I said earlier, if you think that it might be valuable to do other talks, let me know because I love doing it.
Yes, I'm telling you
Yes.
right now. Yes, it will be.
Yes. And I'm
Yes, yes, yes.
inviting everybody who has stayed
Yeah.
around to email or text me or whatever, call me, whatever, and let me know if you can think of anything that would be a great topic.
I can
Okay.
tell you right now, Betty, I would love you to give a talk on phenomenology.
Just on phenomenology.
Yes.
Amen. Yes.
Okay. I'll
Yeah.
work on that, my dear.
All right.
Oh, I would love it.
Great. All right, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
tuning in
Thank
tonight. And
you.
thank you,
Thank
Betty,
you,
for
everybody. This is wonderful.
Thank you, guys.
Andy.
It
Thank
really
you,
means a
Betty.
lot to me. Your comments really mean the world. So thank you.
all right.
Oh, you are.
Good
you are-
night.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody.
Andy,
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Andy,